move right into our next discussion, and this is Dr. Clifford Goldsmith, who is the Chief Medical Officer and National Director for Microsoft Health and Life Sciences. And we have Dr. Luca Brunelli, who is the Professor of Pediatrics and the Director of the Genomics Program at the Utah School of Medicine. And I'm very excited to hear an update from you gentlemen who met last year at our leadership forum. And this is one of our success stories as to how we are able to make those connections and to be a convener. Clifford and I were on a call. And shortly before that, I had met Luca, and he was talking about the amazing things that he was doing. And Clifford started talking about a project, this pilot project that Microsoft wanted to, that was interested in launching, but he needed a very specific partner, and we were able to connect the two of them, and the rest is history. So this is not really a moderated session. You two are up here, and I'm going to sit here in case you need me, but I don't think you do. And I'm just going to let you guys talk about what you all have been doing together. Give us an update. Would love for the audience to hear a little bit about how iSPI played a role during this process. And I'll turn it over to you guys from there.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So as Sherry said, just like the previous session, we really owe this industry and academia, or industry and clinical collaboration, to iSPI and to you for introducing us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk, when we first spoke last year at the iSPI meeting, and then when we spoke again on the phone several times and put this together, we participated in, I do have to change the slides. Oh, that's not, sorry, won't you put the slide? Oh, there we go, okay. Microsoft participated actively and is participating actively in this global commission to try and reduce the time to diagnosis for rare disease. And so I'm going to explain what that was and what we wanted, what it is, and then why we wanted to bring the work that we're doing in a pilot form to the US in a bigger, scalable way. And that's really what has led to this collaboration. And Luca's going to talk about that, where we're going with that pilot and collaboration. So the first thing I wanted to say is that about 5 years ago, Microsoft got a new CEO. His name's Satya Nadella. And I don't think I would be at Microsoft today if it weren't for the fact that he took over, because he came into the company and he challenged us to make a difference. He said, let's stop this discussion of, Wall Street and the quarters, and they'll take care of themselves. And they have, actually, because of it. But he said, let's leave that and let's make a difference. And I was ready to leave because I wanted to make a difference. And so I said, okay, I'll take him up on this. What do I have to lose? And I went to a partner of Microsoft's, a customer partner, really. Their name, a big pharmaceutical company, Shire. And today they're owned by Takeda. They were bought by Takeda, so it's now Takeda. And I said to them, our CEO says we want to make a difference. What could we do together that would really make a difference? And their answer to me was, can we reduce the time to diagnosis for rare disease? And you can see why that's an important issue. Bruce made it abundantly clear this morning that, first of all, Bruce said, even though it's very traumatic what he's going through and his family are going through, he's been actually particularly lucky, because there are 7,000 diseases, as he said. The average time to diagnosis is 5 years for diagnosis, 5 to 7 years for diagnosis. The average family will see 9 different specialists before they get a diagnosis. And so you can see in his case it was a little earlier than usual, but it often takes much longer than that. And so I said to them, let's do this together. And so the first thing that we did is we put together this global commission. It has been led by Microsoft. In this case, it was our worldwide CMO, who I work closely with, Simon Cars, who's moved on to go back to Australia, actually, to run a health system in Australia. We chose a patient advocacy group to join us. And at the time when we did this 2 years ago, we chose Eurydice, which is the European Rare Disease Commission. We've subsequently decided we want to expand that because of the various rare disease organizations that would like to be part of this organization. So NORD and CORD and others now all are represented under Rare Disease International. And then Takeda has a representation. But the real key to this was what we were just talking about earlier, in fact, what Sarah was talking about, that it really requires this kind of collaboration in a big way across the world. And so we have 15 people. I'm not going to go into the details there. This was the original group, and that's being expanded right now. The commission, I don't want to say too much about this. These are on the slides, and you'll get the slides. But really, the goal of the commission when it started was to spend 1 year trying to look at what could be most impactful and look at technology. And you've heard quite a lot of people today talk about technology being really important. And so this was the goal. What could we do that would really make a difference from a technology point of view? And it got broken down into 3 broad categories. And the group worked, or 4 categories really. And over the last year, up until last February, we worked on these 4 areas. The one area that was empowering patients and their families, which you've heard very clearly from Bruce, the need for that. The second area was actually was equipping the frontline physicians, so PCPs, particularly with a shortage, or pediatricians, particularly with the shortage of geneticists that there is. And the third area was really about trying to reimagine that whole genetic consultation. And it led to, again, these slides are very detailed, and I'm sorry about that they're hard to see, but it led to 3 pilots. And those pilots are continuing now this year, and we're going to talk about one of them. Luke is going to talk about one of them. But one of the pilots is around using machine learning or artificial intelligence to improve the diagnosis of rare disease. It's a complicated diagnosis. Often it's in a black box. Most of the screening, the genome screening is done. It's pretty unintelligible to most physicians. And the goal here was to take both phenotypic data and genotypic data, and you'll hear more about this, and to use that to reduce the time to diagnosis. The work we did initially, actually, one thing that becomes very clear is that the personal stories are really motivating, and personal experiences are really motivating. And very soon after we announced this relationship, we found out that somebody at Microsoft who lived in Spain had a child. He worked in Microsoft Consulting Services and had a child with Dravet syndrome. That's a serious problem with epilepsy, and he had become very involved and actually approached us and said he'd like to join us. We've actually had that same thing happen across the company. Since people know that we're interested in this, we've had people from Malaysia, we've had people from here in the US come and join us with their families and who have real personal stories. So the person in Spain actually, being a developer, had actually begun to work using some resources from Microsoft, which he had actually spoken to Satya Nadella and had been given some resources, and he had started to develop an AI model and actually had created a foundation which has been supported by the Global Commission, and that's the Foundation 29 that Luca will tell you more about, that we're going to move that forward. The work has been done at La Paz Hospital in Madrid at this point, and that's the work we want to expand. There are 2 other areas that are really important. I'm not going to spend any time on them now, but the one is making your record available to you so that you can move from those physician to clinician, those 9 visits that you need, making the record more portable. It's really trying to make a portable registry, and we've been looking at using blockchain to do that, and actually doing that in conjunction. That's being done in Europe at the moment, and it's being done in conjunction with the World Health Organization, who are also interested in a highly portable personal record that can be secured, properly secured. And then the third area there is really around virtual consultation and virtual genetic consultation, including things like cognitive computing, cognitive services like facial recognition, voice recognition, and others. And at the same time, and I'm really not going to spend time on this now, we've also been looking at policy. And some of the policy you've heard about, again in Sarah's talk particularly, where we've looked at so some of the policy recommendations that we've been making are how do you take centers of excellence and actually have governments encourage those centers of excellence and encourage sending people to those centers of excellence across the world. And so that's really important. Genetic screening, that's very much a part of this pilot that Luke is going to talk about. It is getting closer and closer to the point that we can do next generation sequencing on every child, but it's still too expensive. And so Luca has an incredibly interesting idea about how to do that in a way that will grow and develop. The third area is data and making sure data is available. And lastly, obviously, that data in a secure fashion. There have been a lot of things that have happened in the last year for us with this Global Commission. We've been and spoken at the World Health Organization, at the Orphan Drug Conferences. We've had conferences ourselves. There have been conferences in some of the countries where there have been people from all over the world that do this. And the last point I just want to make before handing over to Luke is that our goal this year is really to make sure those 3 pilots that I spoke about are, number one, are worked on, and that we get to a point by May of next year that we can say something about the value of those technologies. At the same time, we want to expand. We've realized that we need to expand the Global Commission. So we are bringing in people, other companies like Illumina that are talking to us. We're bringing in other software vendors that are interested, and we're bringing in other pharmaceutical companies that are interested as well. So I'll stop there and hand over to you.
Thanks.
Can you bring up the next thing?
All right. Thanks, Clifford, for this, and everybody here for this wonderful introduction. I think rare genetic disease is something very close to my heart. Being a neonatologist and seeing the kids in NICUs that are affected by these diseases. I think that thanks to the work of many, and certainly Stephen Kingsmore and his group, we heard Albert this morning from Rady Children's. They started their work years ago, actually, in Kansas City, but I think that certainly has opened everybody's eyes to the fact that we have many, many kids in our NICUs with rare genetic disease that we didn't even imagine a few years ago. I will say we started doing in Utah rapid sequencing in the NICU in the form of a rapid exome with a turnaround time of about 3 to 7 days in October of 2015. And the first child we did was so, it just changed my life forever. And after that child, I will never be able to practice neonatology without having a rapid either exome or genome sequencing available because I feel that in nowadays world, you just can't be able to support families as much they need without that technology. So some of the key questions that came about over the last few years are how do we really try to make rare genetic disease, how do we comprehensively diagnose rare genetic disease throughout childhood and actually beyond that, throughout adulthood. So here in this slide, I would just like to point out some of the partnerships that are existing and some of the efforts that are taking place to try to really get to that situation of diagnosing those about 700 different diseases. So we know the newborn screening as it happens currently. Every state in the US, many countries around the world apply newborn screening to their newborns. Oftentimes, the number of diseases we are addressing with this program are relatively small, 30 plus, maybe 40 and a few more in some states. But if you think of addressing 7,000 diseases by adding one disease at a time, as the current model is trying to do, I think it becomes clear to everyone that we're very unlikely to get there. And HRSA, the agency within the Health and Human Services here in the US, who really deals with populations in need, is the sponsor of the Advisory Committee on Heritable Disorders in Newborns and Children, has really clear at this point that the current model is untenable going forward. Being part of the ACH-DNC follow-up and treatment work group, the last meeting in Washington, D.C., beginning of August, we heard both from NIH and HRSA the fact that they want new ideas because it's clear to everyone now that the current model is very untenable going forward. Other efforts, Clifford mentioned the Global Commission, there's Undiagnosed Disease Network and rare disease efforts going on at NIH. There's also a Newborn Screening Translational Research Network that really is charged from NICHD with the goal of trying to develop new models for for newborn screening and how to screen for rare genetic disease. So I think that the current paradigm of adding one disease at a time, and these calculations have been done. We know that depending on the incidence of some conditions, you might need for one condition alone to do a pilot that involves 200,000 individuals. You can just figure out in nowadays economies of scale how that would be challenging and to reach the 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 diseases. There's another paradigm that has been applied to newborn screening, which is the fact that we need to have treatments. Well, we know from CRISPR-Cas and other molecular therapies that are being developed nowadays that really that paradigm might be changing. And we more and more appreciate the fact that even just having the information available to families is changing lives, and being able for a family to know whether they will have a risk of recurrence of that condition that has occurred in their newborn child is very, very helpful. So what do we do with these other diseases that we are not currently screening for? Well, I'd like to propose that we're currently really in a beautiful maze. We're trying to add new diseases. This is challenging, and how do we go forward? Well, we need what I would call a radical solution. We need a process that starts at birth and continues throughout childhood. We do need to engage pediatricians, primary care providers, because we don't have resources to spare to do otherwise. We know how challenging and difficult it is to train new geneticists and how that is going to take time. But we really do want to get to a stage where we will be able to get early diagnosis and shorten that time that Clifford was talking about to diagnose all rare genetic disease and change medical care. So the question is, how do we get there? Well, as I mentioned earlier, rapid genome sequencing, rapid exome sequencing in the NICU has really changed the paradigm of how we care for newborns. And so if you would allow me, I would sort of argue that if we want to go in that direction, the direction of screening every single newborn for rare genetic disease and start them in that path of close follow-up, currently the cost of rapid genome sequencing cannot be applied to every newborn. So we need a pilot that will test this model in a unique patient population. And I think level 4 NICUs in which the most critically ill and sick infants are, is the way to go to start this process. I think the other thing that Clifford mentioned, and that is really changing the paradigm and can enable primary care pediatricians to become the front line, if you will, of this effort, is machine learning, artificial intelligence approaches. I think because of this, we can envision a pilot that would essentially screen and sequence every single infant admitted to a level 4 unit over a specific period of time. Currently, we're thinking about for about a year. Some of those infants would be diagnosed right away. We anticipate about probably 10 to 15% at this point. And then everybody else would enter a follow-up phase. And thanks to new artificial intelligence-based algorithms, and I'll tell you a little bit more about which ones we're planning to implement, would be followed over time throughout childhood. And the initial target that we're setting for ourselves is a 5-year follow-up period. And through that follow-up period, both machine learning algorithms would sort of help pediatricians screen those kids who would go on to develop signs and symptoms of a rare genetic disease with that genome information that is available from birth. So how are we thinking of doing that? Well, we are putting together a conference in Washington, D.C. in early September. And we think we have some of the key players that will be participating in this conference with the idea of launching this pilot. So we have NIH. NICHD is the primary host of this conference. HRSA, as a federal sort of representative of populations at risk, will be there as well. This is really spearheaded by the Newborn Screening Translational Research Network that is funding essentially the whole conference. And the question is, where are we going to do this? In which sites? Not because we want to have sites that are going to keep that information to themselves, but really to use sites that can leverage their knowledge that then we can expand to everybody else. And we came to the sort of determination that University of Utah and Rady Children's are two ideal sites to launch this pilot. So representatives from multiple departments at the University of Utah and from Rady Children's Genomic Institute will be there as well, together with leadership from the Newborn Screening Translational Research Network from actually a number of universities around the US. But we also have people from Spain, so Julian and his foundation will be there, because Julian has really developed a tool that has given us a lot to think about. Often we are thinking of whole genome sequencing as something that can only be deployed through institutions that have a lot of expertise and knowledge. But we really want to be able to put that information to use to every single newborn eventually around the country. And to start that process, we need to have tools that make interpretation of genome information easily available to everyone. And I think Julian, starting from this sort of standpoint of a father who, with a child with a rare genetic disease, really realized very deeply how hard it is for pediatricians of any subspecialty to arrive at a diagnosis rapidly. And so he really sort of developed DX29, this tool that integrates genome data with deep phenotyping through machine learning and natural language processing. Now, what's exciting about this is that there's other investigators who are developing these kinds of tools. As you know, the Rady's Institute of Genomic Medicine mostly uses fabric genomics tools for their genomic analysis, and those tools really rely heavily on algorithms that have been developed at the University of Utah by Mark Yondell and his group. And I'm talking about Fever and VAST algorithms. They're really part and embedded into those tools. And Mark is actually coming out this summer with a new artificial intelligence-based approach that we'll be hearing about in Washington, D.C. in September. So we really want to ask the question also of how do we integrate multiple tools maybe. We still don't know which could be best for arriving at a diagnosis. And it might be that during the newborn period, we'll need to use certain tools and then others during the follow-up phase. But we are talking to phase 2 gene, for example, and they will be very interested in participating in this, although their algorithm really doesn't work well in the newborn period, but then works much better, would work much better in the follow-up phase. We're talking to Mendelian. We're talking to Illumina because Illumina recently sponsored a study that took place in 5 NICUs around the US, and they're certainly interested in these kind of approaches. We realize that the cost of whole genome sequencing currently, and I would put that cost at about $3,000 to $4,000 per person currently, is too high for us to think of deploying this in every single newborn in the US and the world for that matter. But that's where we want to go, and the idea that we can show in a selected population that has kids with acute and who are very sick from the time of birth could be a way to go to really show everybody that that there is a lot that we need to accomplish, and that the market for companies that are making these type of tests available is not just few selected kids, but is every single newborn. And that, we hope, will move the needle forward and allow everybody to join us in these attempts. Thank you.
So thank you, gentlemen. Are there any questions from the audience about this work, this amazing work that's going on? Yes, Suresh.
Thank you. Great talk. This is for Dr. Brunelli. You had mentioned the cost of whole genome sequencing at $3,000 to $4,000. I've heard numbers as low as $1,000. And is the plan, the overall plan, to bring down that cost, or also promote exome sequencing so that full genome sequencing may not be needed in all instances?
That's certainly something I personally don't control as a cost. Certainly, in other, yes, there are costs as low as $800, $600 that I've heard from different, in different countries as well. I think that the cost of whole genome sequencing and whole exome has decreased dramatically. I think that for all intents and purposes right now, we're not really looking for rapid sequencing at anything that is outside of coding regions of the genome. And so one could think about whole exome, of course. But I think that going forward, that those non-coding areas and those genes whose expression might be changed will become more and more important, and we'll be able to look at those regions more and more. And so I think we really need to look at whole genome, and that cost will continue to come down, and especially sort of showing that more and more kids need this for their health and well-being, that will help drive costs down.
Thank you.
We have, yes, time for one more question. Yes?
Hello, this is Mickey Fokin with Dallas Children's. Could you talk a little bit more about what scaling out might look like post-pilot?
Yes. So currently we're thinking of doing the pilot in 2 units in Utah and 2 units here in California. Utah would be primary children's. It's level 4, and it's really a club. As you know, the primary children's is an intermountain facility staffed by University of Utah faculty. So it's an interesting model already for collaboration. I'm happy to say that this program is a collaboration among University of Utah and Intermountain, as well as the Utah newborn screening program. The other unit will be the University of Utah NICU, where essentially all the complex anomalies or complicated pregnancies in the state of Utah are born. So the unique feature about Utah is that Utah is big enough to have high acuity, but at the same time is small enough to essentially have, as I was, the two of us were talking the other day, to have essentially only one level 4 unit that is responsible for the whole state. So you're really able to look at things from the perspective of the whole state. I think the other aspect that makes Utah interesting, now as a disclaimer, I should say that I'm still a faculty member at University of Nebraska. I was in Utah for 8 years, moved to Nebraska for 2 years. I'm going back and starting back in Utah in September to really launch this program. And we're all extremely excited about that. But the other aspect that makes Utah interesting is that, for example, in the Division of General Pediatrics at the university, there are people who are essentially in touch with 90% of the private practices in the state, and sort of can provide us then a good follow-up model for when these kids, after discharge from the NICU, will need to be followed up and cared for and screened for. The 2 NICUs in California will be Rady Children's and then Chalk. Rady Children's has an established relationship with Chalk. So then the next phase that we envision is to expand it to, I could see an intermediate phase where we would expand it to more level 4 NICUs across the US. But eventually, I would really like to see this expanded to every single level 4 NICU in the US. For example, in Nebraska, there's about 26,000 deliveries each year. About 3,000 of those births go through a NICU, but some of those are level 2s. And so number of kids admitted to a level 4 are really down to less than 1,000. So I think, even with these high numbers and with the cost that whole genome sequences has currently, we could scale up this program to encompass the whole US. And I think HRSA's involvement at a federal level will be critical to make that need felt really at the federal level and at the state level. I would see a next phase where we would really expand this to all kids admitted to a PICU as well, because there's so many kids who then go on to have, to be relatively healthy at birth, but then be very sick by the time they're 2 months of age or 4 years old. And then, expand to every, newborn and really replace the current model of newborn screening from a model where we screen for just few diseases and that happens in birth and then it's done and over, to a model where we sequence everybody and then we have that genomic information that can be can be reanalyzed easily at low cost through some of these programs like Julian has generated or others, and really make it available to everybody. How quickly we'll be able to do that, it will depend on the cost of whole genome sequencing, how that goes down and how quickly that happens. But I think at least starting from level 4 NICUs will be critical. And we want to have a very inclusive governance for this kind of pilot. We'll actually have a pediatricians from Dallas who will help us do that, and others across the U.S. We want really this to be everybody's efforts and not just ours.
Thank you.
So Luca, thank you for that. So next, PEDS 2040, I hope that we have Chalk, we have Rady, and maybe we have Dallas up here as well as some of your partners. That'd be exciting to see. Thank you all so much for participating, for your support. We really appreciate it. Clifford, you guys at Microsoft have been amazing partners for us. We can't thank you enough for believing in us and supporting us throughout our journey at iSPI. So let's give these gentlemen a round of applause.
I would say this would not be possible without iSPI.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Luca. Thank you.